Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about humility and openness to engagement. This may be a slightly different angle on humility than what you've been hearing in this course, or whether what you've been thinking about it, if you have been thinking about humility. It's got different aspects. The first aspect I'm going to talk about is why not intellectualize humility. Because when we talk about engagement, it brings up all these messy things like emotions and people and changes and situations and so on. So why not intellectualize humility? Second, I'm going to start thinking about how do we understand engagement? How can we understand engagement? What does it involve? Third, I'm going to be talking about one little exploratory study that we did trying to investigate humility in relation to openness to engagement. And then I'm going to kind of conclude with how do we actually understand and relate both of these concepts and these ideas. Okay, so why not intellectualize humility? I come from psychology, so thinking about humility was an accident, but my background within psychology has been very much an attempt to understand the role that emotion plays in how people understand people, in how babies get drawn in to being part of a particular cultural and social fabric, and about how babies begin to understand people. And for me, the process is fundamentally emotional. So within that kind of domain, or within that kind of phenomena in terms of human functioning, the idea of putting thought first, putting the intellect first, or the idea of rationalism as the most important thing in understanding how we function seems quite bizarre. But rationalism has been very dominant, certainly within psychology, probably within a lot of the other social sciences as well. And John Haidt, for instance, has described the focus on rationalism as being like the emotional dog being wagged by its very little cognitive tail. Why does he say this, and why should we actually put rationalism into a very small, confined space rather than let it be the key to understanding everything human? Well, one reason is that if you look at development, at very many different aspects of development, people have generally tended to think about these aspects of development as being thought-led. Take self-consciousness. People think about self-consciousness as being that which children get when they are able to think about themselves, when they're able to have a concept of self. And yet there are other people who argue that's not where it begins. It ends up there, and that thought keeps developing, but feeding into that thought or into that concept must be a whole host of other emotional experiences and emotional developments. Or take moral judgments. We're all very familiar with this phenomenon that we pronounce upon the morality or the immorality of capital punishment or corporal punishment or whatever you want to call it, call them. But what usually happens in there is that we have a gut reaction first to any one of these phenomena, and then we justify them in what are palatable conceptual terms. And what's palatable varies from society to society, from group to group, and from age to age. So it seems to be, I would argue, and many others would argue, that emotion is the key thing that we need to understand in order to understand almost anything human, right? But what we usually do is resort to rational explanations. Now, there's something called Ngram, which you can find on Google. And it basically gives you a kind of a count of how many times a particular word has been used in academic discourse over years and years and years. And it's a really interesting exercise to look at the use of the word rationality and use of the word emotion over the last, say, 100 years or so. And what you do find is that the word rationality is actually decreasing in its frequency of usage, and the word emotion is increasing, rather slowly increasing, but it is increasing in its frequency of usage. And you might think, well, maybe the battle has already been won. Maybe we've already recognized that emotion is key. Not entirely. There's another reason why you might think the battle's been won, which is if you look at studies of artificial intelligence, somewhere in the 1960s and 70s, the attempt to create an artificial intelligence was led by reflective rules, right? And it's like that's been long abandoned now as being inadequate, because the reflective rules reflect what's actually going on in intelligence. They don't lead to intelligence. They are not the primary mover of intelligence. So, okay, so has rationalism already declined? Do we have nothing to worry about? Are we already good at understanding the roles emotion play? Well, I don't think it is. I mean, if you look at what is dominant, what is most frequent in terms of psychological publications, I don't know about philosophy, but I would imagine, actually, I'm pretty sure I'm right, that even in philosophy, it is the cognitive that is dominant. Okay? So you might argue, don't make a difference between the cognitive and the emotional, but we kind of do, and the cognitive very much tends to be dominant in psychology, in philosophy. It tends to be more prestigious, it's more analytical, it sounds better. It sounds more academic, doesn't sound wishy-washy. So there's something going on there which is stopping us from seeing these phenomena in emotional terms. This focus on thought and on the use of rationality has also been characteristic of approaches, traditional approaches to humility. So there has been a general attempt to think about humility as a thought, as a way of thinking, not as a way of feeling, not as a way of responding, not as a way of reacting, not as something you do, but it's what you think that we usually think of characterizes humility. Traditional approaches to humility also seem to rather focus on the self, right? So we think of it traditionally as a way of thinking, but a way of thinking about the self, okay? Not about other things. Now, this I kind of also find funny, peculiar, but I'll come to that in a second. So the traditional approaches, it's a way of thinking about the self. It used to be thought, say, 30, 40 years ago, that it's a way of thinking negatively about the self, of putting yourself down, of being definitely not boasting, but not just modest, but of actually thinking of yourself with some kind of a humbleness, right? Not thinking good of yourself. That's shifted. So people have now come to start thinking of humility as, okay, it's a way of thinking about the self, but not negatively about the self, rather more accurately about the self. So it's kind of putting yourself in a sort of a correct, truthful place in relation to other things or other people. It's also, traditionally, a third thing, thought of as a rather special and saintly trait. Okay, so to be humble, you can't tell anybody that I'm a humble person, because that is kind of, it contradicts itself. But also, not just that immediate contradiction, but we also tend to think of humility as something that's a bit rare, something that occurs in rather special people. So we talk about Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, or Mother Teresa, and thinking, oh, that's humility. Well, there is an argument, and I would make that argument, that if we understand humility, if we break it down to understand how it looks on the ground, it's actually a very ordinary thing, and it's happening or not happening around us all the time. In the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a kind of a shift from what I said earlier was a very negative way of looking at humility as negative thoughts about the self, to a greater accuracy about the self. So the traditional criteria, the more recent criteria for humility, in Jun Tangni, for instance, she lists a number of criteria whereby you can identify what's going on in humility. You don't have to have all of them all the time. You might have some, might not have others. You might even have just the one, but these kind of help steer us towards an understanding of what's going on. And I'll list them so that you have, for one, an accurate assessment of one's own abilities and achievements. You have an ability to acknowledge mistakes and limitations in knowledge. Okay, you have an openness to learning from new and contradictory information and advice. You have an ability to see oneself in perspective as one in a large scheme of things. And you have, which for me is the most interesting, a relatively low self-focus and an unselving or a forgetting of self. I love this word because it's vague, because we don't really understand what it means, but it really opens up, it challenges us to think about what it might mean. So these criteria have shifted from the negative to the accurate, and they've started to bring in a few more, but I think not quite enough, of the emotional and the ordinary and the relational into our understanding of humility. So there's three problems, as I see it, facing how we understand humility now. One, Is humility fundamentally an intellectual process? Is it a process based in conscious thought, or is that just our cognitivist bias in thinking about anything? Second, is humility really a trait, a characteristic of the individual? Is it inside the person? Is it really so stable and pin downable that we can identify these are humble people and these are definitely not humble people? Or is it something kind of much more diffuse and fleeting? Third, is humility limited to special situations, to conflicts and to relationships, to special relationships? Or can you experience humility or its absence in ordinary, everyday encounters? What does humility actually look like on the ground? What does it feel like? Well, I'm going to be arguing throughout the next few episodes on this topic that in our everyday lives, there are millions of encounters where we could meet humility or its absence. You show your Oyster card on a bus to the driver. You buy a train ticket at a counter. You buy a pint of milk at the corner shop. You pass a student on the stairs. You put your bin out for the bin men just as they come to collect them. You answer a call from the call center. Well, all of these are kind of potentially very difficult things which draw out at different times different things from you. Each one of them could go in different directions, and I think can bring out the presence or absence of humility, which you might sense for 2 seconds and then forget about them seconds later. There are options and choices and events that touch our daily lives, that depend on the fears and anxieties and preoccupations and moods that we begin with. They occupy our emotions and our relationships and involve often small doses of humility and arrogance, without us even knowing it, in the form of closing off encounters with people, and in the form of disallowing some conversations and allowing others, in the form of seeing the other that we're talking to, as a person, in the form of a person, rather than in some other form. So in the next section, I'm going to move on to what this other form might be.